Our guest tonight is the lead author of Waterfalls of the White Mountains, 30 Hikes to 100 Waterfalls. This hiking guide first came out in 1990, was revised in 1999, and had a major revision in 2019. Outside of his professional work as an international development economist, he's been hiking in the Whites and elsewhere around the world for decades. As a volunteer naturalist for the Appalachian Mountain Club and volunteer nature guide at Mass Audubon's Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary, his special interests include birds, trees, and regional history. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Bolnick.
Thank you, Carol. It's my turn now, right?
Right.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. As Carol mentioned in her introduction, I'm Bruce Bolnick, and I'm the lead author of the book on waterfalls of the White Mountains, 30 Hikes to 100 Waterfalls. So I appreciate your joining me for a tour of some of the finest waterfalls in the White Mountains and some hiking tips and some short excursions into White Mountain history as well. I say some of the finest waterfalls because the book covers 100 waterfalls, and you don't want me to try and cover 100 waterfalls in the short time we have. So I'll select some of the waterfalls that are either some of my favorites or waterfalls with an interesting story associated with them. But this is also a book talk because I'm talking about a book. And so before embarking on the waterfall tour itself, I'd like to begin by sharing some behind the scenes stories about the process of producing the book and some key features of the book itself. So let me start out. This is just a background slide. It's Crystal Cascade in Pinkham Notch. So my wife and I finished hiking all the 4,000 footers in the White Mountains in 1986. And we thought, well, okay, what do we do now that we've hiked all the 4,000 footers? At that time, the 100 highest and other 52 with a view, those really weren't anything that people were paying attention to at the time. At least we weren't aware of it. So we decided to visit all the waterfalls in the White Mountains. And it turns out that there was no guide to the waterfalls whatsoever. The White Mountain Guide, of course, the Appalachian Mountain Club White Mountain Guide was available. And if you read through page by page by page, you could get some idea of quite a few of the waterfalls. There was also one hiking guide that was available, Daniel Doan's 50 Hikes in the White Mountains. And he mentioned a couple of waterfalls, but not very many. So we actually had a problem on our hands trying to find all the waterfalls. What we did was we looked at old White Mountain guides, we looked at old maps, and every time there was a river that had a couple of waterfall indicators, we made note of that. And we tried to visit literally every waterfall that we could find. This is Gem Pool on the way up Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail, just as a background for my opening remarks. In 1988, 1989, we spent most of our weekends, unless the weather was too bad, trying to hike to every single waterfall that we could identify. And we had between 150 and 200 waterfalls that we were looking at. And I then drafted a couple of sample chapters and decided right from the outset that I wanted this to be partly a waterfall guide, partly a hiking guide, but also partly a history book because of my own interest in local regional history. And I thought that would also make it more interesting and make it a unique product in the market. So after I drafted a couple of chapters that worked out pretty well, I sent it to the Appalachian Mountain Club thinking they would jump at it. And instead they rejected it, saying that it would compete with the White Mountain Guide, and they didn't think it was a good idea. So instead, I sent it to Backcountry Publications in Woodstock, Vermont, which was Dan Doan's publisher. It's a division of Countryman Press at the time, and they jumped at it. They liked it very much, and that meant that I had to sort of put on hold my academic career. I was in academics at the time, and work on a waterfall book for the next couple of years, and it finally came out in 1990. So I wanted to mention also, just as a point of interest, that I actually wrote the book initially on a K Pro 2 portable CPM computer that weighed 26 pounds. And it had only 64 kilobytes of RAM, a 9-inch monochrome display, and it was on 5¼ inch floppy disks. And I actually still have those disks. I wish I still had the computer. It would probably be worth something now. The first edition came out in 1990. Have this here. And it it had some very special features compared to all the other guides that were available at the time. First of all, it had these what I called historical detours. Look for every single waterfall chapter had a history section that I called the historical detour, and it covered a wide variety of topics: the early explorers, the early settlers, the Indian Wars, the logging railroads, the Victorian hotels, the birth of environmental movement, and that was part of the fun of doing the book, was probing the history relating to all the waterfall areas, regions that I was looking at. There was also a section on the geologic history and mapping of bedrock geology, section on weather and hydrology, some photo tips. I was not a professional photographer by any stretch of the imagination, but I had help of some photographers, and this was back in the days of film photography. So in the first edition, all the photos were taken by myself or my wife, Doreen, who was a co-author of the book. It also had hiking tips and swimming tips and a section on waterfall hazards. I want to emphasize one thing from the very first printing of the first edition. I call this the Phantom Bushwhack chapter. It was one of my favorite chapters in the book. And it was, as you can see from the slide here, about waterfall bushwhacks, because many of the waterfalls that we had found in these old maps were not on trail. And we did a lot of bushwhacking to try and find these lost waterfalls or unnamed waterfalls, just to see what they looked like. And this chapter was part of the book initially. But after the book came out, the first printing of the book, we received a letter of complaint from a very famous White Mountain author, Guy Waterman. Laura and Guy Waterman were probably the most prominent authors of White Mountain literature in the second half of the 20th century. And Guy sent a note saying that he objected to this chapter being in our book. Now, Guy and Laura, they were among the preeminent bushwhackers. They just had a reputation of climbing every summit in the White Mountains from every direction in every month of the year, whether there was a trail or not. What he objected to was encouraging other people to bushwhack. His argument was, if they want to bushwhack and they know how to bushwhack, that's fine, but we shouldn't be encouraging people to do this, because many people might not be prepared. So we had a little family powwow, myself, my wife, and my son, who at the time was 15. And I voted to keep the chapter, and my wife and my son voted to drop it. So it was only in the very first edition of the first printing of the book. And that's why I call it the Phantom Bushwhack chapter, thanks to Guy Waterman complaining about it. Keep his name in mind, because it'll come back in a second. So after the book came out, we received word that from the publisher that a photographer named Bob Koclow, he's also a dentist from New Hampshire, he had hiked every single waterfall in the book, taken beautiful photos of all the waterfalls. This particular photo is of the first cascade on Cascade Brook in Kinsman Notch, which is an absolutely fabulous hike, very steep, beautiful waterfalls for about half a mile going up this the Cascade Brook. And Bob volunteered to let Countryman Press use all of his photos for free if we produced a second edition of the book. And they liked that idea, because his photos were far more professional than the ones that we had in the first edition of the book. So in 1999, the second edition of the book did come out, 30 Hikes to 100 Waterfalls, with a picture of Silver Cascade on the cover. And it featured Bob Koclow photos. Also, my son Daniel became co-author. He did the revision between his Peace Corps volunteer stint in Tanzania and starting graduate school in evolutionary biology. And so Dan is a co-author in the second edition of the book. And the foreword in the second edition was written by Laura and Guy Waterman, because they appreciated the fact that we had taken the Phantom Waterfall chapter out of the book. The reason that I had Dan do the revision of the book is because I was living overseas. I was posted in Malawi and in Mozambique for 5 years as part of my career. And I was not available when the publisher wanted to produce this new edition. So I turned it over to Daniel, who did an excellent job. One interesting feature of the second edition is we had a phone call a few years later, not from me, but from my wife, Doreen. And it was from a USAID project. They were working on a trail guide for a national park in Rwanda called Nyungwe National Park. And they wanted to invite her to write the trail guide and draw maps. And the reason they called her is because she had drawn all the maps for our waterfall book. And so 2007, she was paid a consultancy fee for hiking every trail in this national park, writing trail descriptions, and drawing the maps for this beautiful book that came out. I just thought that was a very unusual side effect from writing a book on waterfalls. Now, another side effect, when we got back from living overseas, I was visiting a small supermarket in Whitefield, New Hampshire. At that time, it was called Sam's Supermarket. And I noticed a rack of postcards, Waterfalls of the White Mountains. Well, that was fascinating. So I went and looked at them, and I didn't recognize any of the waterfalls. I was stunned. And I looked on the back, and it was all the photographs were by a photographer named Chris Whiten. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And he had purchased the first printing of the book that had the bushwhack chapter. And he then started bushwhacking to all kinds. He was basically bushwhacking up every stream in the White Mountains that looked like it might have waterfalls. And he found dozens and dozens of new waterfalls. And some of them were really beautiful waterfalls. So after seeing, I contacted Chris and explained what he had done. And after realizing that there were now dozens and dozens of waterfalls that I knew nothing about, I'd never visited, I was sure there would never be a third edition of the book. It just didn't make much sense. Well, I also found out when I got back from living overseas that there were now a flood of waterfall materials. My book, as far as I know, was the very first in what became an industry on writing books about waterfalls. There was waterfalls in New England, waterfalls of the Northeast, waterfalls in Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, Connecticut. Everybody was writing a waterfall book, and that reinforced my feeling that there would never be a third edition of the book. Then, surprise, I got a call from the publisher, Countryman Press, which was now in New York City as a subsidiary of W.W. Norton, and they wanted me to do a third edition of the book. So I spent the next year revisiting waterfalls. I brought in a friend, Kyle Vanderland, to help with the hikes because my knees didn't want to do the longer hikes anymore. And so the third edition is written by myself, Kyle Vanderland, and my son, Daniel Bolnick, who had been responsible for the second edition. This third edition had full color photos for the first time, and the photos are mostly by Bob Koclow and Chris Whiten. And there are a few that are my photos, but mostly by these two outstanding New Hampshire photographers. For the first time, there are full color contour maps, professional contour maps, instead of pen and ink maps from my wife. There are updated trip descriptions, and a lot of the trails and trailheads have changed. There are now GPS coordinates and information on altitude gains. The publisher also insisted that I include some new waterfalls. And my first reaction to that was, well, there aren't any new waterfalls, but I realized there were quite a few waterfalls that I had not included. So I talked to people like Bob Koclow and Chris Whiten and Steve Smith, who's the editor of the White Mountain Guide, to get ideas about other waterfalls that I can include in the book. And we ended up adding a chapter on waterfalls in the Sandwich area and a chapter on waterfalls in the Berlin area. In order to keep the 30 hikes theme, we consolidated some of the earlier chapters. I also got new material for the historical detours because I had internet access now. When the book first came out, I could only use material that I could find in libraries. My wife was a reference librarian, so that helped a lot. But I now had access to new material, including, for example, the 1874 First Geological Survey of New Hampshire by Dr. Charles Hitchcock. And I could find online the first edition, 1907, of the White Mountain Guide to read what the trails looked like, and also a variety of different guidebooks to the White Mountains that came out in the 19th century to get more historical background. And that was great fun, and to dive back into the history. There's also a new section on the ecology of White Mountain streams written by my son, Dan, who's a professor of biology and ecology at University of Connecticut, in case you're interested. So that's some of the background about the production of the book. Let's turn to the waterfall sampler. And I'm going to, as I mentioned, talk about some waterfalls that are just special favorites of mine, and some others that just have interesting information about them in terms of historical detours. Well, the first waterfall that I'd like to cover is the one that everybody considers to be the highest waterfall in the Northeast, Arethusa Falls in Crawford Notch. Arethusa Falls, depending on who you read, you can get estimates anywhere from 140 feet tall to 200 feet tall. In the book, I call it 176 feet tall because the only time I've seen anyone write a statement about the height and say they actually measured it was in an 1875 book by Moses Sweetser called The White Mountains, a Handbook for Travelers. And he claims that he and Professor J.H. Huntington of Huntington Ravine fame visited the waterfall in 1874, and they actually measured it. Now, as you can see from this picture, measuring the height of the waterfall depends on where you start up at the top and where you start down at the bottom. So you can get a variety of different measures simply because people choose to start and end the waterfall at different places. But anyway, call it 176 feet, call it 140, call it 200. It's an absolutely exquisite fall. The trail to the falls is about 1.4 miles. The parking can be atrocious, and the trail can be quite crowded as well. But it's well worth the effort to get there. I wanted to mention that historically, this is fascinating because it's in Crawford Notch. The Crawfords lived in Crawford Notch from about 1817. The Crawford Path on Mount Washington was established in 1819. They never mentioned this waterfall. They did mention a very small waterfall on the same brook, Bemis Brook, down by what is now the Route 302. But it's not only not mentioned by the Crawfords in any of their books or any of the other books in the middle 1800s, but even the first geology of New Hampshire in 1874 does not mention Arethusa Falls. So it essentially was an unknown waterfall well into the 1800s. And I find that absolutely fascinating simply because Ethan Allen Crawford and the Crawford family lived right nearby here, and they were famous hikers and explorers. But we're very lucky that everyone knows about it now and can visit this absolutely beautiful waterfall. Okay, Arethusa Falls is one of the premier waterfalls of the White Mountains in Crawford Notch. Glen Ellis Falls is one of the most beautiful waterfalls. This is in Pinkham Notch, and at Glen Ellis Falls, it's a 65-foot waterfall. It's this pitcher spout. It's very accessible. It's a 0.2 of a mile trail from the road through Pinkham Notch, very, very near the AMC headquarters. You have to go down some steep steps, so if you're in really bad shape, then it may be difficult to get there. But it's actually within walking distance of the AMC Pinkham Notch headquarters. And there are also some fine little cascades through the Conway granite down below the waterfall that not many people visit. The Glen Ellis Falls was first mentioned in the literature by New Hampshire historian Jeremy Belknap in his History of New Hampshire in 1785, I think he wrote it. He visited this area and camped near the waterfall in 1784. Now, think about it. The Pilgrims established Plymouth Colony in 1620. So we're talking like 150 years before people discovered Glen Ellis Falls, and even longer before they discovered Arethusa Falls. So this area was really wilderness for a very, very long time. In Belknap's History of New Hampshire, he talked about the trip he made to this area. He hiked up through what is now Pinkham Notch, and he referred to the roaring torrent near his campsite in what he at that time called the Eastern Pass on Mount Washington. And he said that the roaring torrent was sublime and beautiful and conspired to amaze and soothe and enrapture all who behold it. AMC acquired the property in 1915 and started building structures there in 1920 in the form of 2 log cabins. And of course, now it's almost a small city at the Pinkham Notch headquarters of the AMC. The very first slide that I had when I started talking, by the way, was Crystal Cascade, which is a very short walk also from the Pinkham Notch headquarters of the AMC. And that is, Glen Ellis is not accessible in the winter. Crystal Cascade is very accessible all year round. Sabbaday Falls is a small one, but it's exquisite. It's off the Coclow Highway. It's about a 3/10 of a mile easy hike up Sabbaday Brook. And if you continue up the trail, you get up to Mount Tri-Pyramid. This was a favorite of the very few visitors who came to this area, even before the Civil War. There was a tourist, it wasn't a hotel, but a tourist lodge in Passaconaway called Passaconaway House. And it was a 1.5 mile walk up to Sabbaday Falls from there. So this was a favorite walk at the time. It was only accessible from the Passaconaway-Conway side because there was no road across at that time from Lincoln. The Coclow Highway was opened only in 1959. So this was something that was accessible from the Conway side. It's called Sabbaday Falls. The story is in Robert and Mary Hickson's Place Names of the White Mountains. They say that it's named Sabbaday Falls because a group of settlers were coming up the Swift River in the mid-1800s, and they stopped to camp for Sabbath at this waterfall. And they decided that the terrain was too rough, and they turned around and went back home. But the name Sabbaday for Sabbath day, the brook is called Sabbaday Brook, and the falls are Sabbaday Falls. So it's a fascinating formation. You have these three beautiful plunges of water into these pothole pools where outwash from the glacier is just carved through the granite, where there was a dike of softer material, and basically created three mini flumes into beautiful pothole pools. Swimming is not allowed here. The trail is very easy. So even if you're not a strong hiker at all, Sabbaday Falls is something that you can get to without too much trouble. And it is quite crowded in the summer. And during peak foliage season, the Coclow Highway is virtually a parking lot. So just be warned about traffic on the Conch. The chapter, let me go back there. The chapter for Sabbaday Falls also includes 5 other waterfalls. The chapter is called Waterfalls in the Eastern Coclow. And it includes, in addition to Sabbaday Falls, Champney Falls, Pitcher Falls, Rocky Gorge Falls, Lower Falls in the Swift, and Soy River Cascades. Here's just a picture of one of them. This is Lower Falls in the Swift River, which is a very popular swimming hole during the hot summer months when the water is not flowing too strongly. When the water level is high, it's actually a whitewater, it requires highly skilled whitewater kayaking to get through this. And it's also very dangerous. People have been killed trying to swim or even slipping on the rocks in high water. But in low water, it's very, very popular swimming hole for people coming in from Conway. The next the waterfall that I want to visit with you is Cloudland Falls. This is on the Falling Water Trail in Franconia Notch. So we're hitting Pinkham Notch, Crawford Notch, and now over to Franconia Notch. This is an 80-foot high waterfall. Just as an aside, I once tried ice climbing, and my first ice climb was on Cloudland Falls, and I decided that it was a completely unnatural act, and I never wanted to do it again. But anyway, it's about a 1 mile hike from the trailhead for the well-known Lincoln Lafayette loop across Franconia Ridge. And a lot of people go up Old Bridle Path past Greenleaf Hut, up Mount Lafayette, across to Little Haystack, over Mount Lincoln, and then down Falling Waters Trail. And when they get to Cloudland Falls, they just stop and rest and enjoy the waterfall. There are actually 3 waterfalls coming down the trail, or you can just climb up the trail. It's a 1 mile hike. And a lot of people just hike up the 1 mile to visit Cloudland Falls as well. Benjamin Willey, writing History of the White Mountains in 1856, wrote about these waterfalls and said they were unrivaled in their scenic beauty. And I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. I'm getting ahead of myself there. Forget I said that. What I wanted to say is that these waterfalls were first mentioned by Moses Sweetser in the book he wrote in 1885. And after that, they just disappeared from all the literature until the 1950s. The White Mountain guides, starting in 1907 until the 1950s, said nothing whatsoever about the waterfalls on this ravine on the side of Mount Lincoln. And the reason for that was because this whole area was heavily logged. In fact, the White Mountain Guide, I want to look at my notes on this so I get it right this time. They described even the old bridle path, which had been put in the middle 1800s after Profile House in Franconia was established as a tourist retreat. The early White Mountain Guide simply described this whole area, all these paths, as long, disused, and the trails had been obliterated by logging. And it wasn't until let me check my notes here. I think it was it was in the late 1950s that the Falling Waters Trail was put in. And ever since then, of course, this has been a favorite for hikers in the White Mountains. I really love getting up there. And the trail going up is a little bit on the steep side, but it's not that bad at all. I should also mention that if you go up to the top of Cloudland Falls, the view across to the Kinsman Ridge is really quite spectacular. And there's some additional small cascades right above Cloudland Falls that are really beautiful in their own right. Okay, let's move on. Silver Cascade, this is where I was getting ahead of myself. Silver Cascade is back to Crawford Notch. This is just over the gate of the Notch, not very far from the AMC facility at Crawford Notch, Highland Center. And this waterfall, like it's a very, very high waterfall. And like Arethusa Falls, there are differences of opinion about how high it is. A lot of the guidebooks say that it's a 300-foot waterfall. And that's sort of the norm these days. But interestingly, some of the early literature, for example, a visitor in 1797, one of the earliest visitors to go through Crawford Notch, even before a proper road was built there, described Silver Cascade. He didn't use that name at the time, but he said he referred to it as sublime and awful grandeur, unrivaled in its romantic beauty, one of the most beautiful waterfalls in the world. And he said that it was 1,000 feet high. Now, these people, actually, it was the president of Yale University at the time who wrote that. And he was smart enough not to mistake 300 feet for 1,000 feet. And I was always puzzled by this until a couple of years ago, I was climbing the Jackson Willie Loop, getting up, which goes up Mount Jackson, Mount Willie, and back down. And just after the trail junction splits, it starts at the top of Crawford Notch. Just after it splits, you cross the same brook 1,000 feet above the road. And guess what? There are cascades there. So what I'm thinking is that back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, this may very well have been a 1,000-foot waterfall because the vegetation may not yet have grown back from even the glacial era. Anyway, that's just a guess. But there are further cascades all the way up on the Jackson Webster trail that you could see. You can't see very much of it because it's heavily overgrown, but by coincidence, it happens to be 1,000 feet above the road. Today, most people drive by Silver Cascade at 55 miles an hour, maybe 60 miles an hour, because they're just driving down Route 302 between the Twin Mountain area, Bretton Woods, and Portland, Maine. It's a shame because it's a beautiful waterfall. Last summer, by the way, this waterfall was almost dry when we had that long dry spell in the North Country. When there's water in it, though, it's one of the more spectacular waterfalls in the White Mountains. In fact, it was the cover photo for the second edition of the book. Beatty Falls. This is in Sandwich, and it's one of the waterfalls that was not in the first edition of the book. And there's a good reason for that, because when we visited Beatty Falls in trying to search out all the waterfalls that we could identify, there was a sign at the parking area saying that this area was for the exclusive use of Sandwich residents and their guests. So we visited it anyway and went away, and then we didn't include it in the book because we considered this as off limits for publicizing in the book. Well, when we were doing the third edition of the book, and everybody told us that Beatty Falls was something we should include in the third edition if we were going to do any new falls whatsoever. It's not a very big fall, but it's it's just wonderful. The formation, not only do you have this beautiful spray of water coming down this slab of rock, but there's a cave underneath the waterfall that you can get into. Everyone said you have to include Beatty Falls. So we went back to the parking lot, and there's still a sign there saying for the exclusive use, at least there was 2 years ago when we visited it, for the exclusive use of Sandwich residents. So I called town hall, and the town administrator referred me to the director of Parks and Recreation for the town of Sandwich. And I called him and said, what about it? Is this really for the exclusive use of Sandwich residents? And he said, well, the sign is still there, but we would like to have more tourists coming to Sandwich. So please do invite people to visit Beatty Falls. And it's and therefore it's actually one of the features of the third edition of the book. It's a very easy trail to get there. From the parking lot on Sandwich Notch Road, it's only a tenth of a mile, a couple hundred yards, or you can come in from the other side, and it's a very easy 4/10 of a mile or so to get here. The watershed for Beatty Falls is not very large, so the amount of water coming over the waterfall often is not huge. But even in relatively low conditions, it's still a very, very pretty waterfall. Now, Thoreau Falls. This is a 10-mile round-trip hike from the Zealand parking area in the heart of the Pemigewasset Wilderness. When people ask me my favorite waterfall, I usually say I don't have a favorite. There are so many that are beautiful, but if you press me on it, I'll say Thoreau Falls. And one of the reasons is because it's a huge, beautiful waterfall, and it's just out in the heart of the wilderness area. And the hike to get there through Zealand Notch is an absolutely beautiful hike. It's an easy hike because you're actually walking along the rail bed of an old logging railroad. Now, in terms of the history, I'm going to have to take a little drink of water here. Excuse me. I actually want to read you an excerpt from the historical detour in this chapter of the book. Because I can't say it any better than the way I wrote it. Okay, in 1884, J.E. Henry, the timber baron, had begun constructing the Zealand Valley Railroad into Zealand Notch, logging as he went. In those early days, Henry was not clear cutting. He concentrated on larger spruce trees in what was then a mature conifer forest. Henry's base was the village of Zealand, located just west of today's Zealand campground. Zealand was then a sizable community, complete with a rail yard, a depot, a mill, homes, shops, school, post office. Today, not a trace remains. In 1886, a major fire consumed 12,000 acres of the forest in the Zealand area, including virgin tracts well up into the Notch. Reportedly, the fire was ignited by sparks from one of Henry's engines. The state fire commissioner in 1891 described the effects as follows. If there is any sight entirely disheartening, keep in mind this is Zealand Notch I'm talking about. If there is any sight entirely disheartening, it is that of these fire-denuded tracts, from which everything has been swept clean down to the underlying rocks. For 7 miles up the valley, the fire swept resistless across it from crest line to crest line. Even the soil was burned, and you could still see ash from those fires today. Yet the logging continued, pushing further up the Notch. By the early 1890s, logging trains ran 11 miles into the former wilderness, crossing the North Fork of the Pemigewasset River, a short distance above Thoreau Falls. A large railroad yard was located where the placid beaver marshes now stand just north of Zealand Pond. A writer in 1892 viewed the operations and called Zealand Valley a vast scene of waste and desolation. In 1903, debris from Henry's logging operations kindled a second fire that burned another 10,000 acres and transformed Zealand Notch into a desolate ash wasteland. The 1922 Appalachian Mountain Club White Mountain Guide was still referring to bare, fire-scarred walls of Zealand Notch, but it also reported that the old rail bed was choked now with young cherry trees. And a 1926 guidebook by Harrington found alders, poplars, and birch growing back as well. In 1933, Zealand Falls Hut opened to the public, and the devastated wilderness was being reborn. By the way, Thoreau himself wrote, "Thank God they cannot cut down the clouds." Thoreau Falls. This is what the mountains looked like back in those days. You might want to look at Francis Belcher's Logging Railroads of the White Mountains for fascinating history of the devastation and logging railroads that were all over the White Mountain area. Dry River Falls, I'm including here. This is an 11-mile round trip. If you're into really rough hikes, this should be one of your targets. But please, you have to be into really rough hikes because this trail is in terrible condition. And it's deliberately in bad condition. The reason is that the trail was wiped out. It was washed out and blowdowns, and the river flooded in the 2011 tropical storm that came through New England. And it took the Forest Service 3 years to restore the trail. And then in October 2017, there was a huge storm and the whole trail was wiped out again. When I was doing the book, I went and talked to people at the White Mountain National Forest and said, "What about Dry River Trail?" And they said they were leaving it open to the public, but on minimum maintenance. So I include this in the book and in the slideshow because I know there are some people who like crazy, rough, long hikes, and Dry River Falls is a great target if you're in that category. Franconia Falls. Gosh, I used to go here all the time with my son when he was young. And you see there's a flume where the fellow is standing on the rock. And then the flume just drops down into this pothole pool. That's actually just wide enough so you can ride down it into the pool. And I've done that several times when I was much younger. The water is extremely cold and the currents are very, very strong in there. But you've got about a quarter mile of polished granite with just a series of cascades and pothole pools. They're very slippery and dangerous when they're wet. And when the water's high, it's not a safe place to be playing around. But when the water's low and the sun has baked the rocks, it's a playground. It's an absolutely fabulous playground. And it's often so crowded that the Forest Service sometimes even posts signs discouraging people from visiting because there are just too many people up there. And that's despite the fact that it's, I think it's 3.3 miles each way to get in to the waterfall. It's a very easy trail though, because on this trail too, it's from the Lincoln Woods trailhead just outside the town of Lincoln. You're following another one of J.E. Henry's logging railroad beds. So it's quite flat. In fact, you can still see some of the old railroad ties as you're walking up along the trail. How are we doing on time? Just about right. Lower Ammonoosuc Falls, I'm including this. This is coming off of Lakes of the Clouds hut, starts the Ammonoosuc River, and it comes down. Lower Ammonoosuc Falls is down in Twin Mountain. And I like this slide because it shows the layered rock. The architecture is really quite special here. But I like the slide because the two kids on the left are the two co-authors of the third edition of the book. So this is one of my own slides from about 1988 when they were both teenagers. On the Ammonoosuc River, there's actually a more beautiful falls called Upper Falls of the Ammonoosuc, which is very popular. And this is up on the base station road heading up towards the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail. Okay, I think I'm getting low on waterfalls here to show you. Cascade Brook, I want to emphasize though, because this is really special. When the water levels are relatively low and the sun is out, there are places here where you could bring a 2-year-old kid and let him splash around in the pools very safely. Obviously, you have to be there guarding them very, very carefully. It's a quarter mile, maybe even more, maybe closer to a half mile of granite ledge with a series of cascades and small pothole pools. It's just an absolutely beautiful spot right in Franconia Notch. And the reason this is so special is because this is just 200 yards away from the basin. And you can get, on a given summer day, you might get 2,000 people visiting the basin. And if you go 200 yards up the trail to the waterfall here, you'll find very, very few people, sometimes hardly anybody at all. So I wanted to give you a clue that if when you're passing by the basin, going through Franconia Notch, don't just stop and go to the basin, go up the trail a ways. In fact, there are a couple of other falls. There's another one half mile up the trail called Kinsman Falls, another one a mile up the trail called Rocky Glen Falls that are also worth beautiful hikes. Bridal Veil Falls, the reason this is a special falls, this is in Franconia on the western side of the Kinsman Ridge, is because this is one waterfall where there's a trail that goes nowhere else. It's about 2.5 miles. It's a fairly easy trail, uphill most of the way. And from the road along the western side of Kinsman Notch in Franconia, there's no trailhead sign. It's called Coppermine Brook Trail. The trail doesn't go up to any mountain, and yet a lot of people come up here just because the waterfall itself is so pretty. It's just a great place for a day hike to spend some time. And there are little ledges, and you can play around right in the waterfall and slide around on the ledges. Bridal Veil Falls in Franconia on the western side of Kinsman Notch. I think this is the last one, Thoreau Falls. This is on Snyder Brook out of Randolph in the northern presidentials. Snyder Brook is very special because the Appalachian Mountain Club purchased the Snyder Brook area, 36 acres, in 1895 to save the old growth forests here from the loggers. And that whole area in Randolph was logged heavily at about that time. You could read about how bad conditions were in the early Whiten Mountain guides that you can find online. So Thoreau Falls, there's a series of waterfalls and cascades on Snyder Brook. This one's about a half mile up from the road, from the Appalachia parking lot. And the water here is very cold because it's on the northern slope of the mountain. And the Valleyway Trail comes up within 30 yards of this waterfall. And Valleyway Trail going up to Madison Hut has lots and lots of people going on it, but hardly anybody detours a few feet to visit the waterfalls on Snyder Brook. So this is another place where you might very easily avoid crowds, even though it's right off of a very, very crowded trail. Speaking of avoiding crowds off of a crowded trail, this one is called the Gorge. There's no real name for the waterfall. This is immediately below Lakes of the Clouds Hut. And if you're climbing up the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail, there's this one stretch of about a quarter mile or third of a mile where you're just climbing up very steep rocky steps. About halfway up that stretch, a little more than halfway up that stretch, there's a spur trail off to the right that used to have a sign there, but that was obliterated in one of those storms. And if you go down that trail 200 feet, you get to this. And this is actually one of the most spectacular waterfalls in all of the White Mountains, and hardly anybody knows about it. Hardly anybody ever visits there. I've occasionally seen one or two other people there. More often than not, when I'm going up the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail and I stop here, there's nobody. I just have this all to myself. Another hint for hikers. Similarly, Coliseum Falls is a really small, absolutely gorgeous waterfall. If you're going to Arethusa Falls, when you're first starting up the Arethusa Falls Trail, there's a cutoff to the left on Bemis Brook called the Bemis Brook Trail. And there's a series of granite ledges, very, very shallow drops that are great playground for kids. And they're very easy to get here. It's less than a half a mile from the parking area. It's a nice side trail. If you're actually going up to Arethusa, you can come across the Bemis Brook Trail. And then after you pass a series of waterfalls, then it's a very steep climb to get back up to the trail. But if you have some small kids, you can just skip the Arethusa Falls altogether and just take the side trail and visit Coliseum Falls. There's another one called Bemis Brook Falls, and another one with a beautiful name, Fawn Pool, just below the one that I'm showing you. You can understand why this is called Coliseum Falls. So one thing I've been emphasizing for the last few waterfalls on the tour is there are some waterfalls that are easily accessible off of popular trails that hardly anybody goes to because they're not aware of them, and they're really well worth a visit. So I've been showing you slides and talking about waterfalls. Thomas Stark King in 1868 wrote, What folly to attempt to draw in words the curves and colors, the coyness, the flashes, the moodiness, the laughter, and the plaints of these daughters of the clouds. I think the best way to see the waterfalls is to get out there and visit them yourself. I want to also emphasize, just to finish up, that there are different seasonal moods. Arethusa Falls, here you have it in the spring, the autumn, and the winter. And the Arethusa Falls Trail is accessible in the winter. And if you're really lucky, by the way, it's beautiful in the winter. It's got these ice flows. It's very popular among ice climbers. And if you're lucky, you can spend your time just watching people trying to get up the ice wall on Arethusa Falls. Diana's Baths over in Conway is another wonderful swimming spot, very, very popular for the people in the Conway area. It's also accessible, and the parking lot is plowed in the winter. And in the winter, it's just winter magic. It's completely different from in the summer, but equally beautiful. And the trail is easy to follow in the winter. It's usually very well packed down. This is the northernmost waterfall in the book, Beaver Brook Falls. And I just want to emphasize one thing here. The picture on the left has a lot of water. The picture on the right has not much water. It's a fairly shallow watershed. It's a very big waterfall, but the watershed often doesn't have a huge volume. But what's interesting is that the huge volume on the left is in the autumn, and the lesser volume on the right is when the leaves are fairly new and fresh in the late spring. And I want to emphasize that because you can get good waterfall conditions any time of the year after a rain. And here's a graph from the book on hydrology. There's a hydrograph measuring water flow on the Ammonoosuc River in Bethlehem. And this is from a storm in 2017 that dropped 4 inches of rain on Mount Washington, which feeds into the Ammonoosuc River. And what's interesting here is that the water level in the river after this one summer storm, it was in September of 2017, the water level increased fourfold within the first 2 or 3 days. And even 5 days later, the water was still 50% higher than it had been before the storm came. So the point of that is that there are great times to visit waterfalls all season long. You don't have to think that it's only during the early season when the water levels are high that the waterfalls can be quite beautiful. Along the way, you can also view the flowers, you can view the lichens, the mushrooms, the frogs and toads, the beaver dams. The picture on the right is a moose scraping on a striped maple tree. In other words, the hike itself is something you can enjoy. And there are thousands of places along the streams that are not named waterfalls, where the water is just tumbling down a beautiful brook where you can stop and meditate, have tranquil 20-minute rest, to have a picnic, or just even stop and wet your feet and enjoy the beautiful streams. It's not just the named waterfalls that are on trail that are of interest in the Whites. Oh, I should have turned on the. You can just listen to the sound of the waterfall, of the stream as it's tumbling down the brook. And of course, the trails themselves are just wonderful. If you're a hiker like me, you just love being out on the trail. And going to waterfalls is just an excuse for getting out. So I'd like to pay tribute to my co-authors, Kyle Vanderland from Lancaster, New Hampshire, and Dan Bolnick, who now lives in Glastonbury, Connecticut. And the other contributors, Bob Koclow, photography, Chris Whiten, photography, Steve Smith, who wrote the foreword to the 3rd edition of the book, and my wife, Doreen, who did the drawings in the book. And she also did all the maps in the first 2 editions of the book. And thanks to the editors and staff at Countryman Press. And the dedication of the book is with deep gratitude to the trail builders who opened the mountain paths and to the crews who maintain the trails today. That's the show. Let me go back to you. Carol, back to you.
Okay, we have a lot of questions.
Uh-oh.
Good ones. All right, hang on. So Paul is asking, can you talk about the techniques that were used to photograph the waterfalls?
Yes, actually there's a section in the book on photo tips, and the section on photo tips is vetted by Bob Koslow.
Okay, good.
um, um, Essentially using very slow shutter speed with a tripod and a filter to minimize glare. It's best when you've got a thin layer of clouds, because if you have open sun, oftentimes there's just too much glare off the water, and the contrast between the glare off the water and the edges of the stream is difficult to get a good photo. Very early morning light is excellent. Sunset or dusk conditions, or just pre-dusk conditions. But if you want a more thorough discussion, you can Google waterfall photography. In fact, the book New England Waterfalls of New England has a website that includes photo tips, and also my book has a section on photo tips that goes into a bit more detail than what I can tell you right now.
Great. So the next question is from Russ Cohen, who actually last Thursday night did a program on edible wild plants and mushrooms for us. But tonight he's asking, in your opinion, which waterfalls offer the best swimming opportunities at or near the waterfall?
Okay, gosh, there are quite a few of them. I mentioned some of them as I was going through my tour. Franconia Falls out of Lincoln Woods Trailhead is a favorite. The Lower Falls on the Swift River, as I mentioned. Diana Baths is a favorite. It's a wonderful place to go swimming. The book actually, in the waterfall descriptions, it explains which ones are the best places for swimming. One of them that's really cool is Jackson Falls. It's actually right in downtown Jackson, New Hampshire. It's just this huge mass of open granite with lots of pothole pools. I once was up in the Whites with a Boy Scout troop when my son was a teenager, and I brought them there. I couldn't get them away. They actually, against my instructions, they stripped down to their underwear and just jumped into the pothole pools in Jackson Falls. What are some of the lower falls in the Ammonoosuc that I showed in Bretton Woods, just outside Bretton Woods? It's a beautiful swimming hole. Actually, really a beautiful swimming hole there, but the water is very cold. The upper falls of the Ammonoosuc, a lot of people do swim there, but it's dangerous. The currents are very tricky, and people have gotten sucked under and died there. So I don't recommend swimming there, but lots of people don't listen for my recommendations. So basically, there are a lot of waterfalls that are great for swimming, and if you thumb through the book, you can get an idea of which ones are good. I think I've mentioned most of the ones that come to mind. And also I talked about the Cascade Brook just above the basin. That's got some great places just to take a dip as well. But I'm sorry, I almost forgot. The best waterfall pool, I call it the Olympic pool, a waterfall called number 13 Falls, which is an 8-mile hike into the western lobe of the Pemigewasset Wilderness. It's actually 2 miles below Galehead Hut. You can come up over Galehead and down, or you can come up from Lincoln Woods, 8 miles past Owl's Head. There's one pool there that it's the size of an Olympic swimming pool. It's really amazing. Very cold water.
That's funny you mentioned Jackson Falls, because there's actually a waterfall behind our library, which is called Jackson Falls.
Okay, I'm referring to the one in Jackson, New Hampshire.
I know. Okay, he had another question, actually. Are there any waterfalls currently accessible by bushwhack only that you think are worthy of having trails built to access them?
Gosh, I don't want. Let me just say, the AMC and the Forest Service have enough trouble maintaining the trails they've got. And Guy Waterman convinced us that some of the waterfalls that are well worth a visit that are off trail are best left to a minimum number of visitors because they're in pristine condition. There's one waterfall that was highlighted in that chapter, the Bush, my Phantom chapter, which actually had been on the trail prior to the 1938 hurricane, and the trail was wiped out. So if you look on old maps from White Mountain guides before 1938, you'll find it. But it's a rough bushwhack to get there, and it is absolutely beautiful. But even leaving footsteps in the moss at that waterfall is leaving too much.
Okay, and there were a couple of questions about indigenous peoples. Kathy asked, are there Native American stories or histories of the falls that weren't discovered by the Crawfords or other explorers? And then Suzanne asked, can you share any history about how the falls were viewed by indigenous people historically? Is that something you've looked into?
Well, yeah, I've read a lot about the early contacts between the colonists and the Native Americans. The White Mountain area was basically several tribes from the Abenaki Federation, which was part of the Algonquin group, and they definitely knew about the waterfalls. The waterfalls for the Native Americans were fishing spots. And during the fish runs, the shad runs, the salmon runs, the Native Americans would gather in the area of those waterfalls to catch enormous numbers of fish. So most of the Native American tribes in that area did not have fixed settlements. During hunting season, they would be one place. During fishing season, they'd be another place. The southern Abenaki along the coast, they were agriculturalists and hunter-gatherers, but up north, they were more itinerant, and the waterfall areas were important for them as fishing grounds. I haven't seen any specific written record left by the Native Americans, although I've read several books about their culture and their interactions with the early colonists. So that's the best answer I can give. They were present in the area, and I don't know what kind of names they had for those waterfalls, but they were important to the Indian culture.
Mm-hmm. So Suzanne also asked, please explain how waterfalls are formed. You mentioned glaciers. I read that the Cascade Falls in Manchester were formed less than 10,000 years ago, and that indigenous people spent time in that area before, during, and after the falls came to be.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of the waterfalls are remnants of the glacial era, and actually, there's a section in the book about the geologic history of the White Mountains and the waterfalls. The White Mountains were actually formed by tectonic collisions hundreds of millions of years ago, and then eroded. I think the figure is like 5 miles of bedrock eroded off the top of Mount Washington, and you could tell that by the types of crystals in the rocks on top of Mount Washington, given the amount of pressure and temperature required to form those crystals. There's a wonderful book published in 2014 called The Geology of the White Mountains that describes the geologic history. But anyway, when the glaciers came through, by the time the glacial era came around, most of the mountains had been eroded away, so they were very gentle hills. And when the glaciers came through, they carved out these notches. And like, for example, Silver Cascade is a perfect example where now you've got this 1,000 feet of cascades down a very steep slope. And Arethusa Falls also is in the same notch. You can just imagine the glacier coming through and scouring the what had been a river valley, a narrow river valley, into this U-shaped notch, and creating these very steep cliffs on either side. Falling Waters Trail fits the same description in Franconia Notch. So a lot of the waterfalls were formed by the glaciers just carving the mountains. Others were formed as the glaciers melted. For example, Sabbaday Falls, and what's the one? There's one in Grafton Notch in Maine. I'm forgetting the name right now. Mother Walker Falls, and even the basin in Franconia Notch were formed by very gritty, strong currents as the glaciers were melting. And then you had these phenomenal currents coming down with lots of glacial clays and grit that just carved through the granite and created a lot of the waterfalls. A lot of the waterfalls are just created where you've got a geologic joint, because the mountains were folded up by the tectonic collisions. So you've got different types of rock side by side now, because you used to have layers and they got crunched up, so they're side by side. And at some of those joints, you've got a harder rock that's stopping the erosion. For example, Coldbrook Falls out of Randolph is a clear example where you've just got a geologic joint causing a drop as a result of harder rock stopping the erosion that was taking place in the post-glacial period. So there are several different ways the waterfalls can be formed, but fundamentally they're all formed by rain, rain and snow.
Teresa asks if Ammonoosuc is an easy hike and how far it is.
The Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail?
I think that's what she means, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very, very popular trail, and a lot of people try tackling it who really can't do it. It's quite steep. My wife actually, as of last year, said she never wants to do it again. And we've been hiking in the Whites for literally 50 years. It's a beautiful, beautiful trail. The bottom part is not all that steep. And my very first slide, the second slide, Gem Pool. So you climb up through the woodlands past the Cog Railway base station, about a mile and a half, and you get to this beautiful little waterfall with a pool called Gem Pool. And then from there you climb steep rock steps for about a quarter to a third of a mile. And then you get onto granite, they're not granite slabs, but they're quartzite slabs, I believe, that are just steep scramble going all the way up to Lakes of the Clouds Hut, with fabulous views out to the west and north. So it's not a hike for beginners at all.
Yeah, I think I've done that trail, and I think I agree with your wife. I don't think I'm going to be doing it again.
Yeah, well, what happened is we were volunteering as naturalists at Lakes of the Clouds last summer, and on the way down it was raining, and the rock was very slippery, and she slipped a couple times.
Oh yeah, we went down. I think is the Eisenhower Trail an alternative?
Yeah, that's the Edmund Path from Eisenhower. No waterfalls on that one.
I think we went down that one because we found the other one so difficult.
Yeah, it's not a beginner's hike, but it's very popular. Yeah. In fact, these days, since they started opening up the Cog Railway Road in the winter, the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail is a favorite for the winter hikes up Mount Washington and Mount Monroe.
Oh, okay. So Margaret asks, given your love of waterfalls, which I share, have you been to Iceland? You can't drive too far without seeing spectacular ones, truly spectacular, one after another.
Yes, and we visited friends in Sweden and deliberately stopped in Iceland in order to visit some of the waterfalls.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
They are wonderful.
Yeah. And then somebody asked, does your book describe the hikes by the level of difficulty?
Yes, every chapter. Let me just turn to a random chapter here.
Yeah.
Okay. So Georgiana Falls, which I didn't mention, it says difficulty is moderate, but some sections are steep. The altitude gain is 350 feet to the lower falls, 740 feet to the upper falls, at an elevation of 1,640 feet. So that information is available every hike.
Oh,
some of them are easy, some of them are actually roadside. Some of them are, as I mentioned with Dry River Falls, are brutal backcountry hikes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was struck by how many of them. I was struck by how many of them you mentioned that really you could park, and if you weren't very mobile, you could go just a few tenths of a mile.
Yeah, a lot of them. If you're in your 70s or 80s, you could still get there as long as you're reasonably ambulatory.
Okay. Then Julie says, thank you for the presentation. Gail says, great presentation. Teresa, wow, thank you. And Elaine said, thank you for a wonderful evening looking at waterfalls. Due to age-related physical limitations, I can't hike to see these, wonderful parts of nature. So it's wonderful to hear and see your presentation.
Great, great, great. Thank you,
Yeah.
Carol, for inviting me to give the talk.
Sure.
And I invite everyone who can to get up in the mountains and visit the waterfalls.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a perfect day, as I said to you earlier, for hearing about waterfalls. It's a day that you could have gone swimming, and it's very motivating to get out there on the trails and see these places. So,
But actually, I may just mention on this last slide
Yeah.
that's showing there now, there's a dimmed image of my wife coming down Cascade Brook in Kinsman Notch.
oh, okay.
Can you see that?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
That's
back one.
great. Great. Beautiful,
Okay.
beautiful pictures.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much again.
Thank you
Appreciate it.
all. And I guess
I
that's
think
it. Everyone have a good night.
Okay. Good night.
Bye.